So we started, it was more than 5 sessions ago, with um, a look at the Torah. Um, and for many Jews, the text that we're looking at now is like the most important text since the Torah. Um, and I want to keep that in mind, while at the same time we think about how it's going to reflect the particular period in which it emerged. So I'm going to share my screen, and that was the wrong screen. Stop the share. Share that screen. And
Or put your name on it, okay? I don't want mine.
okay, that's not supposed to be there either, but that is excellent. Okay, that's our start. Yeah, we looked at the emergence of the Torah all the way down through the Hasmonean Revolt, the emergence of the Mishnah, which is going to make a reprise this in this class, and then of course to the Talmud Bavli, which is very central to tonight's class. And last time we looked at the emergence of the Sidur, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, and the Zohar, all of which have some place in terms of their relationship to the material now. But tonight's class, actually, and we're gonna go back to Maimonides and look at his Mishnah Torah briefly. And then we're going to look at some other major codes that emerged. We're not going to actually spend time on them, but we're going to refer to them. Asher ben Yechiel, the Rosh, was a major figure of Ashkenazic Jewry, but then moved to Sfarad and moved to Spain and was very influential there as well. His son Yaakov ben Asher wrote the Arba'at Turim, that is what's also called the Tur. You can see if you're looking on the timeline here, the Arba'at Turim. It's also called the Tur, and it's the document that created a code of law that largely depended on his father Asher ben Yechiel's work, but he was the one who came up with this structure of dealing with just 4 sections of material, that is the Orach Chaim, Choshen Mishpat, Yored Dea, and Even HaEzer, dealing respectively with daily life, issues of prohibitions and permissions and kashrut and things like that, business law, and family law. Just to give you some context, this all emerged before the Black Death destroyed a third of Europe's population. About 50 years after the Black Death, there were these major riots in Spain, which we didn't talk about last time, but is relevant to the emergence of the modern period. These riots in Spain were brought about the death of large numbers of Jews, but more importantly, it was when Jews in Spain were forcibly converted in mass, and the Jews who converted were then presented a real problem for the church, because were they sincere converts or not? That is what causes the emergence of the Inquisition. The Inquisition was not about Jews. The Inquisition was about Jews who had converted to Christianity, and the concern about whether those Jews were or were not, whether those Christians were or were not sincere, is what caused both the Inquisition and ultimately the expulsion from Spain. Before that, there's the expulsion from France. And I stupidly did not give you an image of a map. I should have done that. But if you think of the map of Europe, with Spain and France and Germany. The expulsion of Jews from France in 1394 really created a huge impetus towards the division of Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jewry, because now all of a sudden it was hard to get from Ashkenaz, from Germany, down into Spain. Because Ashkenaz used to be both France and Germany. It was not that difficult for there to be interactions between them. But once you kick the Jews out of France, it was much harder for that kind of cultural interaction to happen, and it led to a real distinctive emergence of these communities as distinct, and with very different cultural. They'd already had different cultures in many ways, but they developed even more significantly during the 14th and the 15th centuries. Um, and then, whoops. Um, so now we get to the expulsion from Spain and what is called the early modern period. When I grew up, when I was taking history in high school, this was not called the early modern period. This period from 1492 to 1789, we called it the late medieval period. But for a variety of reasons, scholars over the past, I don't know, 30, 40 years have started referring to it um, as the early modern period, and that's now the most common way of referring to it, because most of the things, the developments of this period, lead to the modern period. They don't conclude the world as medieval. In fact, you see few traces of the leftovers of medievalism. You see a lot of the predecessors of what emerges in the modern period. So that begins with the expulsion from Spain and these massive migrations, especially for Jews, but there was also an expulsion from Austria. And significantly, this was a little earlier, but the emergence of new technologies, and especially the printing press. There's an amazing piece of work on the printing press as a source for social change. A lot of it has been critiqued, but it's still an amazingly powerful piece of work, and it's worthwhile thinking about the ways in which communications technologies, like the printing press, change everything. Um, in between 15 and 19 and 1523, a Christian scholar named Daniel Bomberg printed the Talmud, the complete Talmud, and it's his format for the Talmud that we still use today. When we talk about the Vilna Shas was built off the Bomberg Shas. Rav Yosef Karo lived in Spain and experienced the exile. Of course, he was only 4 when that happened, but he eventually, after moving from um, Salonika and that area, he ended up moving to Tzfat, where all of those other Mekubalim were, Moshe Cordovero and Isaac Luria. But he himself was deeply influenced by Kabbalah and mysticism in that period, but was known largely for his halachic work. And Moshe Isserlis, who's also crucial in the story of the development of the Shulchan Aruch, um, lived somewhat later, but was a great scholar and was from Krakow, Poland. And ultimately, the Yosef Karo's version of the Shulchan Aruch was published in 1563. And that's the text that we're going to be looking at tonight and its reception. So before we get to that, I want to go back to the Mishneh Torah, because we looked at his Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, last time. But I want to take a look at why he wrote this massive code of Jewish law in 14 parts. And this is source 1 on your source sheet. So he starts out by saying, at this time, because of troubles, the wisdom of our ancestors had been hidden, and therefore the interpretations, laws, and response of the Gaonim, which used to be perfectly clear, have become difficult to understand in our days. Now, he frames it in this very traditional way. because of troubles. Doesn't say what they were, but he says, we don't get them now. We don't understand them, or people do. Only a few people understand them correctly. Obviously, he includes himself in that. And even fewer understand the Talmud, either the Bavli or that of the land of Israel, or the Sifra, or the Sifrei, or the Tosefta. People, you need to have a broad background and wisdom, and crucially, a lot of time to learn from them properly what is forbidden or permitted, or the rest of the Torah's laws. That is, he's looking around at Spain in his own time period and saying, these people don't know Talmud. And you have to ask yourself, like, they've got more money than Jews ever had before. They've got an incredibly educated population. Why don't they know Talmud? And the real issue here is a curricular one. That is, Maimonides was both a recipient and was deeply aware of the fact that Jews in Spain had expanded the curriculum of what it meant to be educated. For him, and if you, I mean, it goes even back to, if you read the poetry of Shmuel HaNagid, he makes fun of people who only know Talmud. Note that in the Gaonic period, that was all that you studied. I mean, the Talmud was the thing to study. But in Spain, in this period, they expected you to be familiar with Arabic, to know Arabic, to be able to write poetry in Hebrew, to be able to study physics, by which they meant all of science, metaphysics, philosophy. You had to know all of these things. And the real question is, like, what happens to a curriculum when you add things in? Do we have any former teachers or teachers currently? What happens to a curriculum when you start adding things into the curriculum?
Subtract.
You have to revise everything you've done before.
Yeah. Yes. So the problem that Maimonides saw was, we've expanded the curriculum and we haven't made it possible for people to actually study Torah properly. So his goal was to make space for the study of science without dropping out Torah study. So that's why he wrote the Mishnah Torah. So if you continue in source 1, he says, therefore I, Moses ben Maimon the Sfardi, have relied on God and studied all these books as I understand them, and have put them together in clear and crucially brief language. That is, brief language. That's the goal, right? All of the things which are forbidden and permitted and impure, along with all of the other laws of the Torah. That is, it's a complete code, or a complete listing of or recapitulation of the Torah Shabbal Peh. This way, the Torah Shabbal Peh will be completely organized without all of the discussion and different approaches. Just clear and accurate statements of law, right? And this is now the right way to do it, so that all the laws will be clear, both to young and old, with regard to every mitzvah and every law introduced by the rabbis and the prophets. That is, the goal is to create something that recapitulates all of Torah Shabbal Peh, admittedly less comprehensively and with a very clear selection process. I don't want to deal with arguments. I don't want to deal with justifications. I just want people to know what the law is, basically. And he wasn't concerned, and you can tell, this is, in addition to the brief language and no discussion, the crucial point is that it's also complete. He's not writing a code. If he were writing a code, he would have written a code that covered the things that were practical. But he doesn't focus just on what's practical. He tries to create a complete recapitulation of the Torah Shabbal Peh. So he includes things like what to do when the temple for when the temple exists, or agricultural laws for when Jews aren't in exile. He doesn't refer to his sources. He doesn't refer to the discussion, the back and forth about how the law is decided. All of that is cut out, right? And that way, it allows somebody to study just these 14 little volumes of the Mishnah Torah and you've studied everything from his perspective, and it's good enough and gives you time to study all of the other stuff, the metaphysics, the physics, the botany, the poetry, all of that. You can get through it. As an aside, I want to quote my friend Sam Feinsmith, um, who lives now in Chicago. He's a rabbi from Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, and I asked him what he thought was the greatest tragedy to befall the Jewish people in all of Jewish history. The greatest tragedy. And you would have thought, like, what might somebody say?
Destruction of the temple.
Destruction of the temple if you're from. And if you're more focused currently, you'd probably say the Holocaust, right? For Sam, the greatest tragedy to befall the Jewish people is what the Rif and the Rambam did to the Talmud. That is, by removing the conversational nature of the Talmud, by removing the agadata, the narratives that provide the body for this halachic discussion, he felt that it did an invaluable, incalculably horrible consequence for all of later Judaism. Just put that in your pocket, and you can think about whether you think codes are as bad as Sam Feinsmith thought. So now we're going to look at the emergence of the Shulchan Aruch, and we talked about the Mishnah Torah just in contrast, so you can contrast what the Mishnah Torah was, what the Shulchan Aruch became. So, as I mentioned, this early modern period was framed by a bunch of really important changes. The first of which, and this is true for all peoples, but specifically for Jews, it's really very visually apparent, is the degree to which this is a period of tremendous migration. And you can see how Jews from Sfarad went everywhere. They went to Amsterdam. They went to Venice. They went to Salonika. They went to Constantinople. They and Aleppo and Sfat and Cairo. And Amsterdam, as I said, was really important. And from Amsterdam, they ended up heading off to the New World. And not too much later than this, right? 1650 in the 1630s, there are Jews who've gone to Recife, who then end up moving into New Amsterdam in 1654. There were expulsions from Austria, and there were led to Jews going east to Lublin, and people going to other places also, down into Constantinople. And because of economic opportunities, Jews who had been very active in Germany, in Mainz and stuff like that, moved to the east, moved to Poland, and eventually moved into the Ukraine also. What this means is that now all of a sudden you've got the emergence of multi-ethnic communities of Jews. Multi-ethnic communities of Jews. It wasn't a Jewish community. You had Jews who had Sephardic backgrounds and Ashkenazic backgrounds living together in Amsterdam, in Venice, in Salonika, in Sfat. And in Sfat, it was where Yosef Karo was. There's a huge amount of really important interaction. Also in, I should say, in Cairo too. I didn't include that, but really very importantly, also in Cairo, there are Jews who are both Sephardic and Ashkenazic, and their interactions create certain kinds of confusion. Oh, I had points here. Didn't include those. Anyway, that was that. Another huge thing that led to that was part of this early modern period is the emergence of printing. So I included here just because it's fun. This is a chronicle that was called Tzemach David, written by Rabbi David Shlomo Gantz, and he wrote it in the early 1600s. And he goes through from creation on down each year listing what happened. And later, I mean, he didn't include it. This, I mean, he ultimately did end up including it with the dates according to the non-Jews because Jews were using them. So here, big entry for 1440 was the emergence of Gutenberg's printing press. And he says, and he thinks it's so great. He says, Baruch hachonen la'adam, that should be da'at, umlamed le'enosh bina. Right? Praise be the one who gave humanity knowledge and taught people wisdom. And then he says, there's nothing like it. No wisdom or device created since the creation of Adam has greater value. Why is printing so amazingly important?
It's an easy way to get knowledge out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, easy is a huge understatement. When you compare it to what happened beforehand, right?
It's
I don't know if any of you have actually sat down for a long time. You probably did it a long time ago. Sat down and actually copied out a long text longhand. It takes a long time, and if you're trying to do it neatly in a way that's going to be permanent, manuscripts are just incredibly time-consuming and therefore incredibly expensive. Unless you do it yourself, and even if you do it yourself, it's your own time you have to pay for. Printing changed everything. Right? It's not just a massive increase in the amount of content. Right? It democratizes learning. And as he points out, not just Talmudic and divine wisdom, but the other 7 wisdoms and other kinds of modern wisdom, like crafts and building and woodworking and stonework and all that. You can learn about all of this stuff. Isn't it amazing? So not only does it change the dynamic of what it means to be learned, it changed what you can use learning for. And there's just so much of it. Also, it means that because publishers want to make money, right, ideas that used to be suppressed simply because of the economics of manuscript production, right, now find a publisher. So you get all kinds of weird and strange ideas that emerge in this period. So you really can't understate the importance of printing. Part of the context of the emergence of the Shulchan Aruch is actually the fact that that Jews weren't the only ones who were reading these books that were being published. Jews were a huge part of the publishing industry, not both because they published, but because they bought books, because they were largely literate. But because those books were getting published, Christians were also reading those books. And there were also a good number, as we saw, of people who had converted out, conversos and others, who had converted out, who could interpret the Talmud for other Christians now that they were Christian. And there was a tremendous hostility towards the Talmud. They said, oh, the Talmud is going to be really problematic. And there have been arguments earlier on using these things in disputations. And ultimately, the Talmud was burnt again. It had been burnt before, but here in 1553, in Italy, it was burnt all over the place. And he compares it to the day when our holy temple was burnt. I think is really interesting. And I think it probably even led to a really interesting book by Daniel Boyarin, in which he talks about the Talmud as the diaspora of the Jews. That is, if you imagine what is a diaspora? A diaspora is when a person lives both in one country and still has an attachment to another country. And what Boyarin claimed is that from the time of the destruction of the temple, Jews were no longer so attached to the land of Israel. They prayed for it and stuff like that. But the real country, so to speak, for the Jews was the Talmud. And so Jews lived both in Spain and in the Talmud. And Jews lived in Ashkenaz and in Germany and in the Talmud, right? Or in North Africa and the Talmud. And burning the Talmud is like sending us again into diaspora. So what do you do? So there was another response, and Christian, especially Christian Hebraists who were interested in studying this stuff, noted that there are parts in the Talmud that actually talk about Jesus, and might be evidence for Jesus, which they wanted. And they said maybe burning it isn't the best idea. So they came up with this other idea, and that is censorship. So in 1563, 10 years later, the church issued this Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a list of prohibited books. And you might think of censorship as just another mode of oppression, but it's really a process of monitoring and controlling what's published, which actually allows some books to be published, right? You could prohibit everything, but by censoring stuff, or by saying this part you have to remove, this part you have to remove, this part you have to, you can't publish this whole book because of this part, right? You're saying the rest of it's acceptable. And so Jews continued to publish. But if they couldn't study the Talmud, how are they going to know how to do halacha? Right? If you couldn't get access to the Talmud, because at least in Italy it had been confiscated, there weren't copies, right? What do you do? So all of these things that we've talked about talk about why did the Shulchan Aruch emerge when it did, right? Part of it has to do with these migrations and the emergence of multi-ethnic communities of Jews, which caused confusion. Part of it has to do with printing and the multiplicity of voices about the law, because now you've got everybody publishing all kinds of things about Jewish law. And the censorship of the Talmud means like there's a real desire and need for other kinds of sources. And ultimately, there was a really important, this led to the emergence of the Shulchan Aruch. In addition to those things, those internal experiences of the Jews, there was also in the 16th century a general effort to codify law. If you look in 1506, in Poland, they published the Consuetudines Terrae Krakiowiae, which are basically the collected laws of the land of Krakow, in Poland. There was in 1530 there was an effort, didn't actually go as well as it was expected, but in 1530 in England under Henry VIII, there was also an effort to try and codify all of law, and they ended up publishing it as these are the laws that from the time of Henry II. And in 1569, there is another compilation of law that's published in Castile. So there's really a lot of different things that underlie the emergence of the Shulchan Aruch. So here is the title page from one of the earliest versions of the Shulchan Aruch. And this is not the same thing that when Rabbi Spitzer teaches from the Sefaria edition of the Shulchan Aruch that he just shares on his computer. It's really nice and easy, right? That Shulchan Aruch includes both the comments of Yosef Karo and the glosses of Moshe Isserles, the Ashkenazic commentator, right? But if you look at this page, which is the 1616 edition, right? This is just an edition of what Yosef Karo produced. And let me so yes. Okay, that's when it was published. It was published in 1665. And here is the way the frontispiece is described with its subtitle, and no one knows actually whether this is his exact language, but it's not unrelated to something that he says later on, which is Shulchan Aruch, which is a table set before the old and young, Lifnei Zakenim Narim, Bekerach Katan Liman Yisa'u Bechekam, in one small portable volume. Bechekam means you could put it in your jacket. Lagopo Bechol Eit Uvechol Makom, which you can study at any time and in every place, whether at rest or while traveling. Right? So his idea is, I'm going to write a complete book that everybody can study, and it's small and it's concise and it's the law. Okay? And that's an earliest edition. And take a look at that should say Yosef Karo, not Yosef Karl. Sorry. Yosef Karo actually had written another work before this, before the Shulchan Aruch, and that work was called the Beit Yosef. And if you actually go in into I can't remember whether he has a Shulchan Aruch. If you go into my wife's office, right, you can see that next to the Shulchan Aruch there's the tour, and it's the tour with the Beit Yosef. So the Beit Yosef is a massive commentary on the Arba Turim that I talked about before, and he decided that he wanted to create a commentary that dealt with all of the legal issues. But look at his logic behind it, because it also underlies a lot of what he was thinking about when he talked about creating the Shulchan Aruch. Right? He says, for in now our time, the Torah did not become like two Torahs, which is a standard concern in the Talmud. It's like two Torahs, but rather like an infinite number of Torahs, because of the number of books which are available to clarify, and I'm putting in air quotes because I think he doesn't think it's clarifying things at all, clarify its judgments and laws. And even though these books were intended to light up our darkness and that is our confusion, we still remain with great confusion because each rabbi writes his own book. And it's very confusing. So what do you do if there's so many books, right? Well, the answer is, of course, write another book. Of course, his idea is that he's going to write a book that's going to replace all those other books, right? So he then continues, I realized that I would have to decide halacha and evaluate different arguments, because the goal is that we should all have one Torah and one law. It is a crucial point. His perspective is, I want unity. I want to get rid of the confusion, and I want uniformity, right? And that's what Yosef Karo, a Sephardi, is really thinking about. If I had to judge between all of the different interpreters of the Talmud, who each have different arguments and conclusions, how could anyone decide between them? So I had to make a reasonable statement. So I decided that the three pillars of decided, didn't mean to do that. The three pillars of decided law, upon which the House of Israel depends, are the Rif, that is Yitzchak Alfasi, who's from North Africa, the Rambam's Mishnah Torah that we started today's class with, and the Rosh, which was the father of the author of the tour, right? So his laws, who's Ashkenazic kind of, okay? When two disagree with a third, I will decide like them, except when most rabbis in the widespread custom disagree with that opinion. So most of the time, I'm just going to basically look at it. Here are the two, there's the third, or they all agree, and I'm going to state this is what the law. And when none of the three addresses an issue, we'll follow after what the most famous sages who've written about it. And that's what that image on the frontispiece that we saw before, those three crowns, refers to the Rif and the Rambam and the Rosh. Right? So that's his model. He's not going to go and try and go back to the Talmud and redo all that work or look at everybody's different approaches. He's going to create a fairly easy path for himself that he'll be able to produce this, statement of law. And then when he turns to writing his introduction to the Shulchan Aruch, he says, I saw that it would be good to collect these laws with brief language, clearly and completely. Getting a sense of a theme here, right? Everybody wants to be clear and complete. so that the Torah of God would be perfect, right? It's Torah Hashem Tamima, it's quote from Tehillim, and fluent in the mouths of all Israel. So when someone asks a student of the rabbis a question about law, he won't get confused, and he'll be able to answer immediately, and it will be clear to him what the practical law is. That is, unlike the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, which was a recapitulation of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, so that you could just study it and then you'd be done studying. But that was never meant to be a replacement for actual halachic study by people who were going to be rabbis, right? The Mishnah Torah was meant to, for your average person, you study the Mishnah Torah, and then you can go on and study, biology and physics and metaphysics, right? But for Yosef Karo, he's expecting that this document is itself going to be studied by people who want to be rabbis, and that's going to work it out. That's going to be the law. And it's clear that he's intending this thing to be a code, which will, as we said on the previous passage, unify and make uniform all of world Jewry, right? That's his goal. So ultimately, we end up with a new edition. The Ramah, that is Moshe Isserlis from Krakow, the Ashkenazic rabbi, was also at the same time as Yosef Karo, who was writing his commentary on Beit Yosef. He was writing his own commentary on the Torah, called the Darchei Moshe, and it was pretty clear to him that Karo's scholarship would dwarf his own because he was a lot older, a lot more experienced, and had already done a lot more with his Beit Yosef. So instead of composing his Darchei Moshe just as a gloss on the Beit Yosef, and supplementing it with the more recent authorities of Ashkenaz, he wrote that so that it would be integrated into the Shulchan Aruch itself. And so you now have the text of Yosef Karo with little glosses of Moshe Isserlis. And they did have a very different approach. Again, Yosef Karo was using these three scholars, the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh. And Moshe Isserlis, his goal was to bring in the most recent people, right? So here's an two different early editions, and here's the inside of it. And those of you who go to Minyan and have studied the Shulchan Aruch with Rabbi Spitzer, this is in Rashi script, but this is the statement of Yosef Karo: Yitkaber kari la'avodat borecha, and then it says Haga, which simply means correction or note. And this part here is the comment of Moshe Isserlis. And it's all written in Rashi script, and that's the way they did in the earliest version. Not sure why. Here is a front page of a different edition of an early edition from the 1700s in Mantua. I believe it's in 1712 or something like that. And it shows pictures of the people who he thinks are really important, right? Rashi, Rambam, the Maharil Weil, an Ashkenazic guy, and the Maharik, that's Yosef Karo, and the Ramah, and I'm not sure who this is supposed to be. I can't read that. In any case, but it's another early edition of the Shulchan Aruch. This is what the Shulchan Aruch looks like nowadays, right? So if you look at the Shulchan Aruch, right, this is Hilchot Pesach, the laws of Pesach, and here, using different typography, you can tell what parts are Yosef Karo and what parts are Moshe Isserlis. So here's the title. That was Yosef Karo. Here's his statement. Shoalim b'Hilchot Pesach kodem lePesach shloshim yom. Meaning we start asking questions about the laws of Pesach 30 days before Pesach. Okay? And then in Rashi script, that's the comment of Moshe Isserlis. And it's a custom to buy wheat and to distribute it to the poor for the needs of Pesach. Also, his point is also starting 30 days before Pesach, which is what we do, right? A lot of people collect both Matanot Levionim on Purim and immediately start with a Ma'ot Chitim, a wheat money fund at the same time. Anyway, this is, you can tell it's much easier to use because of the different type fonts. But it's not that Rashi, because we call it Rashi script, Rashi didn't write in Rashi script, has nothing to do with Rashi. It's just because Rashi shows up in Rashi script that we call that Rashi script. And clearly in the earlier version, as we saw, right, both Yosef Karo and Moshe Isserles were in Rashi script. Okay. So take a look at what Moshe Isserles was doing when he decided what he wanted to do and how he responded to Yosef Karo. It is known that the rabbi, the Mechaber, and note the language, he calls him the Mechaber, the compiler of the Beit Yosef, by his nature followed after the great sages and determined law according to the testimony of 2 or 3 wonderful Gaonim, that is the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh, in every place where 2 of them agreed. But to the other great rabbis of the Torah, he paid no attention. And even though they are, and here you see the difference in his perspective, even though they are earlier scholars and not the most recent scholars, and he didn't pay attention to what the earliest of those earlier ones yelled, that is the Rif, who's the earliest of the ones, said at the end of chapter 2 of Eruvin, and the others agree with them, that one should determine law in all cases according to the most recent decisors and not the words of earlier rabbis. That is, the Rif says the right way to determine the law is look at the people who are contemporary. The later scholars are the ones who are authoritative because they see more. They've seen all the arguments since then, right? Despite the fact that the Rif says that, that's not the way the Yosef Karo determined the law. And Yosef Karo's focus was, the earlier people are closer to Sinai. They're greater scholars than we are. We're mice compared to those people. We're going to follow them. And these are the great pillars of Torah study. And for Moshe Isserles, no, the crucial point is halacha k'matrai. You have to follow the law according to the most recent scholars. And that's a basic difference in approach, right? Earlier is more authoritative, according to Yosef Karo, whereas why is it? The law is according to the most recent decisor is the way Isserles would frame that. There were other people who also had very strong opposition to the emergence of the Shulchan Aruch. And this is where we're starting to get a larger sense of the ways in which the Shulchan Aruch and the response to the Shulchan Aruch really reflects the early modern period. Because you have this massive dispersion in the early modern period, and at the same time, really concrete and strong efforts to try and counteract that dispersion and that disorientation that came from that by creating uniformity. And Jews just don't like that. There was response to that in the Gaonic period. There's response to that in the early modern period as well. So he starts by quoting a passage from the Talmud, Sota 22, that says, the Tanaim who erode the world are scholars who establish law based on the Mishnah. And that is a real, that is, what does it mean for Tanaim who erode the world? They're people who establish the law based on the Mishnah. But he's saying nowadays, if people would decide the halacha from the Mishnah, that would be great. Or at least better than what we've got. For at least the Mishnah is part of the Talmud. Right? And he's saying, and this is Yehuda ben Mitzalel, the Maharal of Prague, whom you may have heard of because there's all the mythology of the Maharal of Prague was the one who made the golem that is this body that was animated by God's name that protected the Jews of Prague. But he was a major scholar and a major Jewish thinker in this period. And he said that, and he complained that people were not establishing Jewish law properly because they weren't going into the Talmud to figure it out. Instead, they established halacha from collections of rulings meant for practical guidance, which were made just to issue rulings, but not to learn from. You can't make real halacha about this. You can only like look something up. Okay, but if you're a rabbi and you're asked a real question, you have to know the real stuff. You have to know the sources of the law, not just statements of law that you can say, well, maybe he means this, and I'm going to apply it this way. Right? You actually have to know the Talmud. And this is even farther from real knowledge. The Rishonim, such as the Rambam and the Torah of blessed memory, even though they also wrote their rulings without explanation, they just intended to provide practical rules. And he's right there, right? The Rambam was not trying to create something for as a code that, or as a replacement for people who wanted to do halacha. It was just a way for people to study Talmud or to study Torah Shabbal Peh instead in a brief way. However, for one to establish halacha from it without knowing where the law emerged from as a law without reason, that never entered their mind. And so his concern is this huge issue of people going through an illegitimate process in determining halacha for their community. His brother, Chaim ben Betzalel, was also a great scholar, and he wrote a book called the Vikuach Maim Chaim, and I got 3 different selections from the Vikuach Maim Chaim, which shows some really a very different perspective than his brother. I mean, he also critiqued the whole process of Shulchan Aruch, but on different grounds. First, he starts out just as someone who only likes food that is prepared the way he likes it and doesn't want to be a guest at his friend's table, so a person may not like the legal teachings other than the ones with which he agrees. How much the more so if he doesn't want to rely on the books of these recent authors and be dependent on their set table, the Shulchan Aruch. Right? That is, halacha is a personal process. Halacha is a process by which an individual rabbi looks at what the law is and decides it. And you don't just look it up in a book, right? For Chaim ben Betzalel, individuals have to have that kind of discretion. And that's why earlier scholars didn't write codes of law about what's prohibited and what's permitted. They would determine the custom and the law for the public. That's why it's surprising, and here he makes a dig, that the great and pious scholar Rabbi Moshe Isserles wrote his code of law, which he called Torah Chatat. He paid no attention to these things that I've written about not publishing a code of law. That is, he couldn't understand why Moshe Isserles, with whom he had studied under a scholar named Shalom Shachna, Yehuda ben Betzalel, his brother, and Moshe Isserles were all at the yeshiva of Shalom Shachna together at the same time. Moshe Isserles was much older, but he's saying, like, this was a great guy. What's he doing? Doing something that nobody did before, and it's totally wrong. That's just not how halacha works. Halacha is something that the individual rabbi has to know about and determine. So that's his first critique. It's a personal thing. And he doesn't understand why Moshe Isserles would do it. And then he zetzes him another one. He does another real strong claim. He says, just as the Rav, that is Moshe Isserles, had to make known the differences between the customs of our land and the customs of the East, by which he means, in this case, Yosef Karo, who is in Sfat, which is to the east, right, as opposed to Ashkenaz and Spain, the west. There aren't any Jews in Spain anymore, right? The Jews from Ashkenaz have moved to the east, right? So is there also a great need to make known the differences in custom between the Jews of Germany, that is Ashkenaz, and those of the land of Poland, Polin. For if the Rav did not want his customs to be annulled in the face of the customs of the land of Israel, how much the more so should the Jews of Germany not have their customs annulled by the customs of the land of Poland. For the Torah is the heritage of the Ashkenazim from the time of the destruction of the temple. So here he's saying, it's not just it's an individual thing. This is about individual cultural communities of Jews who have their own customs. And how dare he write a code that's based mostly on the customs of Poland, and as if that's what Ashkenaz is, when he's wiping out the traditional customs of the Jews who live in Germany. And you might have assumed that Chaim ben Betzalel himself is German, and he's making this argument. He's actually not. He's also Polish. But he's making the claim on behalf of Ashkenazic Jewry, saying, like, how dare you write a code that's supposed to supersede local custom? So it's not just that halacha is an individual thing, an individual rabbi might want to be able to decide things differently. But communities have identities, and identities are important. And you shouldn't just wipe them all out. Just like Yosef Karo shouldn't wipe out Ashkenazic Jewry by publishing a book that's largely Sephardic, right? You, Moshe Isserles, shouldn't have put in your own words there, because now you're wiping out the cultural work of Ashkenazic Jewry. The amazing turnabout, and very different than his brother, the Maharal. And then he says, I don't even keep my notes anymore. Why? He says it's perfectly acceptable, logically, for a person to take notes and to collect new ideas which are found in the writings of earlier legal authorities. And again, you can imagine, right? Here he is living with printing, and there's all of this new stuff that's out there. How do you keep up with it? Well, of course you have to take notes, right? You keep a little notebook. Oh, look, I found in this art in this little pamphlet a great new reading of this, and you write it down in your own little notebook, right? And I would organize those notes as personal reminder, and he did it for about 16 years. But the students who were living in my house stole it from me and copied it in secret. And when I found out, I took the copy from them. I had only put it together for my personal use as a memory aid, and certainly not that some other person should rely on it as authoritative. That is, he's so concerned that people might misuse his work, right? That are simply notes, that he doesn't take notes anymore. And he's worried that if you reduce something to writing, you're possibly contributing to what is a serious problem for halachic process. So at this point, I want to stop, and I want to talk about what is responsible halachic process. Whoops, that was not supposed to be that way. So I'm going to go back. Okay, so before I thought that was going to be animated, and you weren't going to see all of those. So what does it take for a rabbi to do halacha properly? I mean, when you go to your rabbi, okay, and you're asking a halachic question, and let's say it's not just like, I'm interested, but this is an actual halachic question. Like, Rabbi, I've got an opportunity to get the COVID vaccine before, Group 1B. I'm actually not there, but I probably could get it earlier because of this. Is it correct for me to do so? Now, that obviously is not an issue that's going to be plain in the texts of Jewish law, right? They didn't know from COVID. How are they going to be able to figure out, or mass vaccination or any of that? Like, how is the rabbi going to be figuring that out? Well, that's going to be not going to be easy for the rabbi, but there are resources. But what would you expect the rabbi to do to be able to give you a good response, and a response that you would consider authoritative, a response that you would consider halacha? Any thoughts?
Check precedents.
Yeah, check precedents. Are there precedents? Figure out what the precedents would be if there are such. Right? Not easy at all. Whoops, didn't mean to drag that down there. Um, um, actually, I think I'll leave that open. We can just look at each other. What would you do? Check precedents. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, I broke it down. I broke it down into 5 parts. I used to break this into 3, but I think it's worth being a little bit more explicit about the other 2. The first part is carefully listening to the questioner. What are they asking for? Because that's going to inform how the rabbi is going to then go and do a fresh and authentic engagement with the texts. Even when the rabbis know, even when the rabbi knows what the relevant sources are, even when he knows them cold, I've taught them 20 times, I don't have to go look at them again. Yeah, a new look is warranted because the details of the question may have influenced his or her reading of the texts. And then you have to consider the audience for the response. Is this truly a private response, or will this response set a precedent for my community or for a larger group? Will it have an impact beyond the rabbi's own synagogue community? Right? So you have to think about that in the process. And then you have to evaluate what's possible. Can the rabbi practically be strict? Because a rabbi can only make law that can be observed. If the rabbi makes law that's too strict, he or she undercuts the authority of the whole system because people won't observe it, and then they won't think that the rabbi is responsible, or worse, they'll think that they're the kind of person who doesn't observe the halacha or isn't concerned about the halacha, right? So you really have to ask yourself, like, what can the community bear, right? Can the community also bear change, right? If I'm going to rule more leniently, not just for an individual, but for the community as a whole, can they handle that? Do they have the intellectual capability to understand why things might become more lenient, right? Like, for instance, I don't know, having streaming on davening for davening, right? Can the community handle that? What do you need to do to make sure that the community can handle it? And then you have to reflect about what God really wants. And this is obviously subjective, but if the rabbi doesn't think that God will be pleased with the answer, the rabbi has to rethink. And from my perspective, this is what it really means to be a responsible rabbi in terms of halacha, right? And of course, this is going to lead to the kinds of things that Chaim ben Betzalel is going to talk about, right? Individual rabbis are going to call things differently, and I want to frame that because I think it's really important that there are really very different conceptions of what it means to be both a halachic decisor as well as what it means to be what does it mean to be a halachic Jew, right? These are really important questions, and there are and these different texts and these different rabbis that we've been looking at, from Yosef Karo to the Maharal of Prague to Chaim ben Betzalel. These are different claims about what a what a Jew is. So I'm gonna and what halacha is. So the last text that I want to look at, and then we're just going to have an open discussion, is this text of the Maharshal, and it's from his work called the Yamshel Shlomo, and he says, recently I bought a copy of Rav Yosef Karo's commentary on the Torah, his Beit Yosef. And students are following his rulings, and they don't realize that many times Karo is deciding against the rulings of the Tosafot and of our Ashkenazic customs, and they are making a big mistake because they see it written. And they say, this is how Rav Karo says the law is. It's wrong that they just believe what is written in a book. if someone alive stands up and cries out that the law is not like this, even with absolute proof, they pay no attention. Right? Because there's this assumption about the authority of something that you see in print. Right? And so he concludes, because of our many sins, ordained rabbis are many, but people who learn are few. And so they grasp at a book like this with all of its new interpretation. And this makes it seem like that the lesser rabbis are the same as the greater rabbis and that youths are like elders. Right? So he's saying there are all these rabbis who don't really know beans. They don't know how to determine halacha properly. They don't know how to study Talmud. They don't know how to look at what the sources of the law are. All they know is, I can look at I can understand the Shulchan Aruch and I can tell you this is the law. Yeah.
We, from time to time, have had these issues when one rabbi had interpreted halacha one way, and 10 years later, another rabbi had been interpreted differently, whether more liberally or let's say, or more strictly. Who then decides what is the halacha for that community and how much weight is given to the minhag hamakom?
Excellent. So I'm gonna frame my response in two ways. One is based on historical sources and how within history, what we've looked at responds to that exact question, and another approach that's going to look at it a little bit more from a more contemporary perspective. I'm going to actually stop the share, and then actually I don't have to stop the share. I can just do like what I did last time. That was great. Okay, so now you've got the whole thing, and you've got this thing on the side too. But this worked out pretty well. So that particular question, we have a rabbi, and he decided differently than what's been done before. So this question came explicitly to Maimonides, and Maimonides said, you don't have to pay attention at all to this new rabbi who's an upstart, who thinks he has basis for what he says, but he doesn't. And there's no and you should follow your well-established law. And that's largely because he looked at the particular issue and he decided one way, and he said, like, of course he's right? It's totally crazy. And I think the actual issue was about. We also looked at a case from the Gaonim that we looked at just in the last class, right? It was about sitting and standing, and what you should do in trying focusing on uniformity. And then of course there's the opposite approach, which is the approach of the Ramah, which is halachat kivatrai, right? The law is according to the later authorities, and if the law is according to the later authorities, right, you go according to your current rabbi. The Gemara has a beautiful passage on that. Actually, it's the Gemara on Mishnah Rosh Hashanah 2:8 and 2:9, where Rabbi Yoshua disagrees with Rabban Gamliel, but nonetheless submits to the authority of Rabban Gamliel. And the Torah refers it is quoted, and it says you have to go to the judge. You go to the Levitical Kohanim and the judge who will be in that day, and they ask, could you possibly go to a judge who isn't in your day? And right, like how could you go to some other judge, right? But the fact of the matter is, you can go to a judge who's not in your own day. One way of doing that is by saying, we're not going to accept the current rabbi's authority. We're going to go back to the previous one. That's one way of not going to the judge in your own day. You go to the judge in the past. Or you don't let the current rabbi make a decision and you put it off until later on, and you say, we'll wait until we get a new rabbi. Or we'll wait until we'll wait till your contract is over and then we'll decide this. Right? And so you could go to a rabbi who's not in your own day, either by going to the past or by going to the future. But the law is you go to the rabbi who is your rabbi at the time. So there are two totally different approaches, right? And both emerge. Largely, if you look culturally, Sephardim would go more with we want absolute uniformity, and Ashkenazim would go with we want the current rabbi to have the authority, and we're willing to tolerate greater differences than what might have been in like a Sephardic community. So I can't tell you what you should do because you have to go to your rabbi, who, by the way, was trained very well, and can make this judgment quite adeptly, I am sure, even if he struggles, because he will go through a fresh and careful reading of the law each and every time. But it's tough, right? I mean, Yosef Karo has another great one where he's dealing with. He says, like, this issue of multi-ethnic communities, right? You've got a community that's well established in a particular place, right? And then all of a sudden, a huge number of people, a new majority of people come in with different customs, right? How many shuls does that happen to, right? You've got a community, it's a shul that's been there for a long time, and then all of these people move into town and they want to change things, right? And Yosef Karo comes down and says, well, they were never, it looks like those new people are a majority, but they didn't all come all at once, right? So let's say you had 50 people there initially, and then another 100 people come all total. But the first 10 came, and they became part of the new community. They came and accepted the new community's rules. What's the new community for them? That is this old, well-established community. They became a community now of 60. And the next 10 came, and the next 10 came, and the next 10 came, and each time they became assimilated into the larger community. And so even if you look back to their histories, it doesn't matter, because like they came in under the assumption that they were going to accept the rules of the community as it was. And that's Yosef Karo's theory. And that's why he says we want, again, stability, uniformity. That's that Sephardic approach, right? Whereas amongst Ashkenazim, there's all kinds of toleration, at least in this period, of different approaches and different communities having different approaches. There's that is a whole other issue. I want to actually go to a few more halachic principles that we looked at a lot of rejection of the Shulchan Aruch, or people standing back from the Shulchan Aruch. But I want to look now at some principles that were adopted. Here, right? These were the themes that we saw in terms of the opposition to the Shulchan Aruch. We saw an appeal to halachic authorities to return to the indeterminate Talmud as the ultimate source of authority. We saw an emphasis on the uniqueness of each individual case and each individual rabbi. And we saw an ascription of privileged status to the custom of local community, right? These were all reasons why people were opposed to the Shulchan Aruch. But within Sephardic communities, there is this general assumption of Kabbalat Hora'ot Moran, right? The accepting the decisions of our rabbi. And note the difference, right? From Moshe Israel's perspective, Yosef Karo is simply called HaMechaber, the compiler, right? They don't look at him as he doesn't look at him as his rabbi. He's simply he's yet another publisher. He did a really good job publishing this thing, and therefore I'm going to put my stuff into his book. But he's the mechaber. But for Sephardic Jewry, they don't call him the mechaber. They call him Maran, our rabbi. Our rabbi. That's the Aramaic form for like Morenu in Hebrew, but Maran in Aramaic. Kabbalat Torah Maran, accepting them. So there's a variety of reasons why they come up with why you do it. So the first one is a principle in the Talmud, ifsika hilchata. That is, you've got law, it's been decided. Okay? And this talks about the right, stare decisis, the importance of stability in a community, and and for people not to think lightly of Torah by saying, oh, it's changing. And like, right, are we, I think, for instance, your particular decision about the way you do live streaming and bringing people into the synagogue and all those, right? These were decisions that were made, okay, that were clearly new, that were disorienting to some people, and some people probably don't use it, don't want it, right? We leave our computer on in my study all Shabbos because I'm not allowed to go into the shul. In our shul, the only people who go into the shul on Shabbos are the rabbi and the cantor, and they do streaming, and we don't have a minyan. So they do all the stuff that they would do as yichidim, without a kaddish, without a kedusha, without Torah reading with aliyahs, right? They do the Torah reading, but they don't have aliyahs, right? These things are very difficult, right? So ifsik hilchata, saying that we've got decided law, stare decisis, we're going to follow the Shulchan Aruch whether it works or not, that provides a certain stability, which you can understand why in the 16th century that was so important. Another language that they used was Mara Da'atra, this language of the local authority, right? And I'm sure that it's probably stated in Rabbi Spitzer's contract that he is the Mara Da'atra, that he is the local authority. He determines halacha in the community. Well, by using that language, they're actually changing what the community is. Instead of thinking the local authority, this guy, Yosef Karo, has now become a local authority for all of world Jewry, Sephardic Jews say, which means they're all part of the same community. It is, it's by using this language, they're trying to at least create the idea that they're all one community. Then there's this principle of lo titkodedu. We want to prohibit deviation and factions, and that's a really big issue because division is also about creating identity, right? Think about what Chaim ben Mitzalelo said about the Ashkenazim, right? Moshe Isserlis, how can you do what you're doing? You're putting the customs of Poland over the customs of Ashkenaz. From the Sephardic perspective, if everybody accepts Yosef Karo, you don't have the same issues of people creating factions, and that prohibition against making factions is called lo titkodedu. Then you got this thing called klalei psika, because the fact of the matter is you can't just follow Yosef Karo. It actually doesn't work because he doesn't deal with every issue, and different communities are still going to read him differently. So they issue principles, which I like to call algorithmic decision-making principles. If this guy says, if X disagrees with Y, then we follow the positions of Y, except for this particular issue. And there are whole books called Sifrei Klalei Psika, the books that talk about this algorithmic decision-making. And this actually reflects, I think, a very interesting and kind of strange halachic approach. But basically, the idea is what we want is the halacha to determine every aspect of our lives with the minimum amount of human input. we want to basically be halachic robots that know exactly what to do at all times because we can follow the rules and the rules are enveloping and complete, right? And that halachic robot vision is one vision of what it means to be a halachic Jew. Another very different perspective is the idea that we are active halachic agents. God wants us actually involved in the process. God wants us to be making the judgments. God wants us to engage in the conversation and for us to try and figure out what we're supposed to do, right? And that's a very different conception. And then this last issue, and this is the way that people who say, we accept all of what Yosef Karo says, right, is except for the one thing that you just mentioned, which is we've got a custom. And it's this issue of minhag kadum, right? We've got an early custom. So how early is early? And if we've got an early custom, do we follow it? And indeed, Yosef Karo specifically referred to it, right? Right after the passage that we'd read before in the introduction to the Beit Yosef, he says this. This is the most correct path. It is the path of the king, Derech HaMelech. But it seems clear that it will cause problems. Because if, in a small number of places, they have customarily followed a prohibition in a small number of matters, even though we've decided the opposite, they should maintain their custom, since they've already accepted upon themselves the words of the rabbi who prohibited. And it is forbidden for them to behave as if it is permitted to them, just because I said it was permitted, as it is taught in the chapter of Makom Shenagu. Right? So Yosef Karo is acknowledging the fact that not everybody's going to want to accept everything he says, because we have a minhag kadum, we have an early custom. How are we supposed? Are we supposed to get rid of our early custom? Right? So if you take a look at it, you can see how he's limiting this space for dissent. He's acknowledging it, but he's really limiting it. First, he says it's a small number of places. And then he says it's a small number of matters, right? That is, I'm not going to sit there and let lots of places say, oh, we've got early customs. All of our customs are early customs. Well, look at all these customs that we have that are early customs that we have that disagree with you, Yosef Karo. We're going to follow you. We follow you, so to speak, but not really. Okay? And he only allows it to maintain a prohibition, but not a leniency. Right? We have a custom that we allow this. No, you can't follow your custom if it's more lenient than me. Right? You can only follow your custom if it's more strict than me. Right? So that's what the Beit Yosef said. Now, if you look at these books of Klalei Psika, they disagree. They say, oh, actually, I heard from this guy who heard from this guy who was the student of Yosef Karo, and he actually said it applies not just to a prohibition, but also to a leniency. Oh, really? He pretty much is very clear here, right? But people put in all kinds of ways to say, we are following the uniform approach of Yosef Karo, but not really. Okay? Because you can't. Because different communities are going to do different kinds of things. And I think the greatest proof of the ultimate, it's not a failure of the Shulchan Aruch, it really is the hallmark, the major code of Jewish law. But take a look at this, which I think is just fascinating. In 1800, Shneur Zalman of Liadi published his own Shulchan Aruch called the Shulchan Aruch Harav. And Rav Avram Danzig wrote his own digest of the Shulchan Aruch called the Chayei Adam. And Shlomo Gansfried in 1864 wrote the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch. And Yisrael Meir Kagan, the Chafetz Chaim, wrote the Mishnah Brura in 1904. And the Aruch HaShulchan was written, completed in 1907 by Rabbi Yechiel Michalevstein. And the Ben Ish Chai, the Sephardi rabbi, in 1894, wrote a whole code of Jewish law. They compare him to the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch. He's the Sephardic Kitzer Shulchan Aruch. And the Kaf HaChaim, which is yet another one, because it wasn't good enough. So if everybody's writing their own digests of Jewish law, right, you have the exact same problem that Yosef Karo was complaining about. It's not 2 Torahs. There are an infinite number of Torahs. There are all these different books. How are you supposed to know what to do? And I pose that back to you, right? As we move into the modern period, right? From the early modern period into the modern period, and these are all, modern reflections. Like, what do we do? And if you don't know what the halacha is, right? Is your first step, I'm going to call the rabbi? My guess is, even with the particular demographic of the people who were at this class, even with that, my assumption is that we've got a lot of people who will inquire of Rav Google, right? You check Rav Google, and what does Rav Google say is the law? And that's I think a typical feature, and one that is I think envisioned by or replicated by all of those different codes and digests of Jewish law that we saw. So it's a tough thing to look at halacha. Now I want to just conclude with just a little observation about what happens else in the early modern period. Right? You see in the early modern period, in addition to all the migrations and the efforts at codification, you see the rise of the kihila, where communities create political structures that govern their kihilot. And they become very, very strong in some ways, and they become very, very weak in other ways. And then they fall apart. That is, there's this effort to try and centralize, to unify, to keep things all one way. And then things tend to fall apart. And you see communities issuing takanot, legislation, that show that their communities are just like falling apart right and left. And when you look at like the classic example of the rise of excommunication that emerges in the 18th century, right? With all these people who get excommunicated, we're kicking you out of our community, right? Does excommunication mean that you've got a strong community or a weak community? Right? And I would say that you probably have a pretty weak community because you can't tolerate that kind of dissent. That may be my own Ashkenazic bias. But the fact of the matter is, you've got communities falling apart. You've also got additional dispersion. You've got Jews moving to this side of the ocean. You've got more different kinds of publication, and you've all of a sudden, and the marker between the early modern and the modern period is all of a sudden you've got Jews who can now be identified as Jews, as citizens independent of their Jewish community. And that's what happens with the granting of citizenship in 1791 as a result of the Sanhedrin that Napoleon reconstitutes. And emancipation emerges in a variety of different ways and in a variety of different places, but that really is the end of this period. And what does it mean to have a Shulchan Aruch, right, when there isn't a kihila that can enforce it? What does it mean to have a code of law? And what does it mean to have law or Jewish law when, again, there's no community that can actually enforce it because Jews function individually and no longer as part of an organized community. So there's a lot that we went through, and I would encourage you to start reflecting on your own processes, your own thinking about Jewish law, as well as your own experience of publication and our own attitude towards books. We looked through a lot of different books over the course of this class, and now in our next section, in our next session, we've got a proliferation of books, lots of them, not just behind me, but lots of different kinds of books. And what does it mean when we think an educated Jew means that you know this and you know that? What do you need to know when of the making of books there is no end?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions or comments or thoughts, reflections on Shulchan Aruch as a document, or the process by which the Shulchan Aruch was rejected or accepted? Go ahead, Steve.
I have a question about these digests of the Shulchan Aruch. It seems to me there would only be a problem if those digests disagreed about what the Shulchan Aruch said. If they disagreed about later issues that come after the Shulchan Aruch, eventually somebody would have to tie all the new issues together. But if they held together, if they all agreed on what the Shulchan Aruch said, then the Shulchan Aruch's project would be successful. So my question is, how much do those later digests actually disagree about what the content of the Shulchan Aruch is?
Quite a lot, actually. Is they don't just look at the Shulchan Aruch; they look at the Beit Yosef, and they look at later authorities, and sometimes it's not so clear and obvious what's in the Shulchan Aruch, and whether are you talking about just what Yosef Karo said, or are you looking at what the Ramah said? So yeah, there are huge communal differences, and now if you look in like the yeshivish community, right? They'll say they'll generally follow like according to the Mishnah Brura, which is among the most strict of these ones. Whereas if you look at lots of other communities, and if you look at somebody like Yechiel Michal Epstein, who wrote the Aruch HaShulchan, he wrote it specifically in response to the Mishnah Brura. He saw the Mishnah Brura, said, "Oh my God, he's way too strict on way too many things," and he wrote his code, the Aruch HaShulchan, in response and in many ways in rejection of the Mishnah Brura. And he's way more lenient on most issues, or on many issues that he considered to be significant. Some issues he's not as lenient, but on many issues he's more lenient. But each one of these has their own approach. And they are significant. I haven't seen anybody who's actually like gone through, point by point, and made like a multiple column document of like lining them all up. But I could imagine, right? I listed 7 of these things, right? You could imagine somebody saying, "Well, if you want to know what to do, you line up all 7 of them, and you count, and the one that has 4 or more, that's the law," right? Like you could do that. You could imagine somebody, but again, that gets you into this, halachic automaton approach, and I think that that's not what God wants of us. Which doesn't mean that I don't have a copy of Klein's Guide for Jewish Religious Practice right over there on the thing, but I've also got a pile of other ones. Right?
I was going to say, the next time we send a book to the entire congregation, we should consider sending Klein.
Well, except for the fact of the matter is, like, Klein is outdated. It's great for its time period, but it was published, ages ago.
It's got that little addendum by Joel Roth at the end. I'm like, where are the other 9 addendums we need?
Yeah. I would rather have, and there are a bunch of really great, serious scholars within the conservative movement who I think could actually produce a new one. But again, I'm not in favor of making a code. I'm in favor of educating people to be able to to engage in the halachic process and to be able to have a thoughtful conversation with their rabbi. I'll share one example of that. So growing up, when I was in high school, that was a formative time for me Jewishly. And my assistant rabbi was Erwin Kula, who is the head of the head of Klal, the Center for Learning and Leadership. Back then, he was my shul's assistant rabbi and then associate rabbi. And I had a variety of halachic questions for all kinds of things. For instance, I wanted to keep kosher, and my parents didn't keep kosher. And how was I going to do that? Well, I went into him and he said, this is a serious question
Mhm.
and come back tomorrow. And I came back the next day and he had a stack of sources for me. And he said, study all of these and then come back to me. Okay. And he put it, we penciled in a date that I should have them done by. And I went through, I studied all the sources and I saw that there were a variety of different responses and issues and possibilities of ways that would make it possible for me to keep kosher in my parents' home. And then we discussed it. And it was part of a conversation. He didn't include anything that he thought was too strict or too lenient. He gave what he thought was the framework and engaged me in the process. It was formative for me as a Jew. And over time, that same kind of interaction happened 4 or 5 times, I think. And then I found out that I wasn't the only. I mean, he didn't do that for everybody, right? Not everybody was willing to do that much work. But he did that for several people. And I think he was training us because he said, like, you're the kind of person who's going to be deeply engaged in Jewish study for a long time. I want you to do it right. And his way of doing it right was engage the texts, figure it out, and let's have a conversation. Other questions or comments? Experiences that you've had?
I believe that it is easier for congregation to work, not more, how shall I say, not that many people in any congregation are that well familiar with the sources and are not that educated, and so they have to rely on somebody giving the ruling. And for the Shalom Bayit, for the congregational community, a Maradatra would seem to be the path that should work.
Well, and indeed, I mean, there was no question. The senior rabbi in the congregation was the Mara Da'atra. But this is talking about an issue of private practice, not an issue of public practice, right? It was kashrut in my own home, and he wanted me to work out, recognize, what are the different values in play, and specifically, he wanted me to figure out like what issues, which were described pretty well in English documents at the time. He started me out with a combination of English and Hebrew. Eventually, by the time I was a senior in high school, he could give me stuff that was all Hebrew. But he wanted me to understand what decisions were possible, what things would be trumped by honoring my parents, what specific kinds of things would cause the greatest amount of sorrows for my parents, and which kinds of things would not. Like if I said I can't eat at the same table, right, which is a possibility, right? If they're having fleischiks and I'm having milchiks, that would cause tremendous sorrows in my family, right? So I worked out ways to deal with that, right? Ultimately, not ultimately, pretty quickly right off, I became a vegetarian. And that resolved a huge number of my problems, right? I didn't have to worry about multiple sets of dishes or anything like that. So there were, like that, but that kind of interaction, that kind of discussion about the process, and thinking about how does each individual little thing relate, and is there a difference between which dishes you use as opposed to which pots you use, right? And I ended up ultimately, like, I had my own sets of pots, my own knives and cutting boards, but I ended up using the dishes that my family was using, and trusting in the dishwasher, and treating it as a clay shani, and saying like there's no cooking going on in these plates. These were leniencies that I don't adopt now anymore, and I don't use anymore because I don't need to, right? But when I was given the choice between this leniency and honoring my mom, okay, and not annoying my dad, right, it became pretty clear that leniency made a lot of sense. Yeah, Andy, you were going to ask a question? You're muted.
I was just wondering whether Ashkenazi and Sephardim define what is halachic differently, if they have a different approach to that.
Yeah, I think they do. I think that there's, I think Ashkenazim, because of a huge difference in the curriculum in what is actually the late medieval period, right? It changed the culture. In the late medieval period, and in the early medieval period, in Sfarad, there was this much broader conception of what you had to study, with less focus on halacha and less focus on Talmud and its diversity. And so you created these codes like the Mishnah Torah, and you study, and so halacha means a much more codified, uniform thing. And amongst Ashkenazim, until the 20th century, amongst Ashkenazim, there was always a much greater sense of the possible meanings that a text might bear, and an awareness that one reading did not necessarily trump another reading. And that allowed for what was largely a much greater pluralism amongst halachic authorities. That pretty much got shot, not in the 20th century, in the 19th century, with the emergence of Reform. Because the Reform movement didn't emerge in the communities where there were Sephardim, with the exception of this country, but that was a whole other issue. But in other countries where there were Sephardim, there wasn't the Reform movement. The Reform movement emerging in the 19th century really transformed traditional Jewry and created orthodoxy. And most of those Jews were Ashkenazic. And so the Ashkenazic tradition was influenced by this orthodoxy, which didn't exist beforehand. There was a response to Reform that became much more rigid. And because they knew more, because there were more different possible readings, they could go and pick and choose the most strict approaches so that they could define themselves as distinct from the Reform. Right? So what early on, the breadth of knowledge amongst Ashkenazim led to pluralism, led in the face of the threat of Reform, which it was really seen by those Jews as a threat, led to this hyper strictness that I think was a very interesting and shocking development, one that we are still paying for. So, okay, so we're a bit late. Next, I admittedly have not done the work for next week's class. It was one that I just said, wow, this is a cool idea. Let's see what I can do with it. So I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to be doing with all the sources for next week. I've got my library, and I'm looking at my library and saying, like, what does it mean to have this library? What does it mean to have an entire bookcase of Sidurim? Right? An entire bookcase of Sidurim, and books on Jewish liturgy. Wow, how does that change things? And what does it mean to be both a scholar, and what does it mean to be a Stam Yid? Given the fact that there's so much knowledge and so much access, where the quality of your questions, honestly, you think maybe like, oh, I'm a novice, I don't necessarily know so much, right? We all know so much compared to your average Jew. I'm thinking average Jew only 200 years ago. There's never been a community that is as educated as our Jewish community. Right? So this is a very strange, right? Like, we are both way more ignorant and way more knowledgeable. And what do we do with that? Anyway, have a great evening. I hope you had a great Chodesh Tov last night and this morning. We had a lovely Hallel at our services. I hope you have a wonderful Shabbos. And I